Load shedding, inefficiency, corruption, debt, and blackouts are just a few words associated with the electricity sector of Africa's most industrialized economy. ESKOM, the state-owned entity that primarily supplies power, has been facing years of issues and challenges that have hampered its ability to deliver electricity to South Africans, their businesses, and the economy. ESKOM's debt reached 484 billion rand during 2020-2021, and it now stands at about 401 billion rand. In the same year, ESKOM received 56 billion rand of government support, without which it would have been unable to service its debt. The company's unsustainable debt levels pose a serious risk to both the country's public finances and the utility. ESKOM has declined from a world-leading utility to one that is financially insolvent, operating at very low levels of energy availability and struggling under a load of poorly designed and project-managed new mega coal projects. It also recently admitted that such interruptions are likely to persist for as long as the next 5 years. This is because of the increased downtime of the rapidly aging fleet of coal plants. But it also is due to delays in setting up new power plants. But finally, the government has agreed to look elsewhere. President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration has agreed to unbundle ESKOM into 3 units. The government has since announced 8 successful bidders for gas, wind, and solar projects under the 2,000 megawatt risk mitigation independent power producer procurement program. It was also announced last year that some of South Africa's biggest cities would be able to source their own power after the Energy Ministry let them know that they could wean themselves off the state utility that subjected cities to outages for the past 13 years. And now the announcement that South Africa is looking to build additional nuclear power plants. Today, we're looking at South Africa moving away from ESKOM. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me from Cape Town, South Africa is Liz McDaid, Parliamentary and Energy Counsel to the organization Undoing Tax Abuse in South Africa. Liz, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge. Welcome to the show.
Hi, and it's very nice to be here.
So let's start with, I guess, maybe the state of ESKOM as it stands now. South Africa's energy availability factor has declined from 94% in 2002 to 67% in 2019. Load shedding has happened over more than a decade now, and it's cost the South African economy billions. But how did the most industrialized economy on the continent get to this point with its state electricity utility?
Well, I think we have to look at what happened in the previous regime, where under President Zuma, now sitting in jail, is that state capture, what's called the state capture project took place. And what that meant is that essential maintenance was not carried out. The utility, ESKOM, embarked on projects that were overrun in budget, went over time, new capacity didn't come online, and it's dubious about whether there's enough skills to keep things going. It's also very clear that we need to modernize. We need to move away from this centrally operated and controlled electricity utility. And that's the recent moves are starting to do that, where we are saying the country will hold onto and own and control the central grid, but the generation will be moved into a separate entity. And that opens up the space for non-ESKOM generation to also then be sold into the grid, wheeled through the grid to customers. So instead of having one ESKOM which owns, controls, and sells the power, it will be a national grid, and different players will sell their power into the grid, and other customers will then buy their power either through the grid from those generators or in general, wheeling it through to someone else. And we think that's a good step forward.
And that's actually the place I wanted to take you. So ESKOM will now become 3 legally separate entities of generation, transmission, and distribution. There's also going to be the Independent Transmission System and Market Operator. And there's also an Energy Planning Center of Excellence that's expected to be established sometime soon in the coming year. But how confident are you that this will sort of bring back the efficiency and capacity that ESKOM has been missing over the past decade and more?
I think it's not going to be instant. And part of that is that we have a gap in energy supply, and we have a whole bunch of ailing and aging coal-fired power plants which need to be retired, and new capacity needs to come up. You did mention the Emergency Power Risk Mitigation Program. That's also been mired in controversy because the projects that ended up getting the winning bids, we have a Turkish company which has won 3 of the bids to moor its power ships in harbors for 20 years. And everyone is quite outraged to say that we are not anticipating South Africa having an energy crisis for 20 years. So there's been some controversy around that. But I think what is also happening, and this is starting to create a different situation, is the president also insisted, and rightly so, that the self-generation cap be lifted. In other words, people can actually generate their own power without the need for full license. And that cuts through some of the red tape, and that enables everything from socially owned power stations to independent business, mines, industries being able to generate their own power. But there's another issue that we need to grapple with, and that is the existing workforce, the existing workers who've been in the coal mining industry. In this transition, what's going to happen to them? And this is very firmly what's on the agenda in South Africa, to ensure that people who are in a sense now in these, I want to say fossilized industries, but in these old industries, how do we make sure that the development of the new industries takes those along and grows those industries? And that's really still being grappled with. But we believe that it's the right direction.
Okay. Are there any proposals on ground, particularly to address this issue of the coal miners that have been involved in the electricity industry? Because we know South Africa has a very strong unions when it comes to workers' welfare. We saw it with the situation with the SAA as well. We're seeing some other ramifications of it in other places. But are there any proposals on the table that have a plan of action on this?
Well, we have a presidential commission on climate change whose role is to ensure what's called a just transition, which in other words is to move from the old outdated energies to the new ones, but in a way that ensures that people do not bear the brunt of that transition. Those affected are protected and brought on board.
All right, so let's talk more about modernization, and you mentioned that earlier. So ESKOM's historical monopoly on generation in South Africa has been changed. You've mentioned that now the president is opening up this area, so there won't be so much dependency on ESKOM going forward. But there have been a lot of questions as to why it took South Africa so long to get to this acceptance point, to get to this point of making it official and getting the plans in place. So why do you think it took so long for any administration, it might have been somebody else who was president, to accept that ESKOM was no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century, wasn't able to deliver on powering South Africa's economy as it should?
Maybe we had I think what we did have is a philosophy where politicians were wedded to the old style of a centralized model, and there was resistance. We also had resistance, obviously, from the fossil fuel industries, and climate change was something that you didn't hear in the energy department for many years. So I think all of those things, plus the state capture, where money was just spent, contracts were given to corrupt people, all of that, which is coming out of our state capture commission, has been exposed. were all of those things that crippled ESKOM in the past. But as I said, maybe there's a rainbow in the cloud, is that it's given the country now had to turn around and say, how do we solve this? And the way to solve it became moving into independent power producers, restructuring ESKOM, and giving the self-generation opportunities for the big companies, right down to shopping centers and right down to communities. So there's a lot of opportunity now. Of course, it's still moving too slowly from our perspective, because now we've got COVID. We're going to need to recover from COVID, and for that we need a strong, stable electricity supply.
So you've talked about communities involved, also moving away. Johannesburg, Cape Town, some of South Africa's biggest cities are literally looking for ways to unbundle and unshackle themselves from ESKOM. I know there are a number of plans in place. These two particularly have applied to source for their own electricity. Do we have a model as to how this would work with them in particular? What effects will it have in terms of cost also that may end up being passed down to the South African consumer who resides in Cape Town or Johannesburg or any of these cities that go sort of independent?
Well, it's not even the cities, it's the small towns as well. So what we have in South Africa is a thing called a cost recovery system. Sorry, it suddenly got noisy here. A cost recovery system, which means that the cost of supply is calculated, and then our energy regulator regulates in order to ensure there's a tariff which covers the fair cost that the generator incurs to generate, and then a little bit of profit, and presumably coming up will be a wheeling fee to get it from where it's generated to where it's needed through the grid. So what's happened is so a couple of decades ago, South Africa came up with the idea of regional distribution companies. And I think that's where the distribution company is going to come in. But the cities and the towns now are able to start buying electricity. So before they had to buy it from ESKOM. If there was an IPP, the IPP sold to ESKOM, ESKOM then sold it to the municipality. But now what we're moving to is a municipality can get its own power station, and then it can obviously sell to itself, or it would be a private company.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break. We are still talking to Liz McDaid. She's the Parliamentary and Energy Counsel to the Organization of Undoing Tax Abuse based in South Africa. While the world is moving away from fossil fuels and taking more cognizance of the climate change issues, South Africa announced that it is looking at building two new nuclear power plants. How does this play into the energy conversation happening in the country? How does this play into the country moving away from ESKOM? And why are some people involving Liz opposed to this? We'll get into that when we come back. Do stay with us. And Liz McDaid is still with me. Let's get into the conversation around nuclear power plants in South Africa. Now, there is a proposal for the country to build new nuclear power plants, and this has been pushed forward since last year and now seems to have made headway in recent weeks. The National Energy Regulator of South Africa's board is expected to make a decision regarding the proposal set out by the Mineral Resources and Energy Minister last year. But the conversation is not a new one. South Africa had signed an agreement with Russia during the Jacob Zuma era for the country to help build nuclear power plants. Now, Liz, you were one of the main actors that, I guess I would say, prevented that from happening at the point in time. And you are still very vocal right now in your opposition to the proposed nuclear power plants. What is the state of that proposal now, and why are you opposing it?
So I think we have to start with good governance and good decision making. And when we look at nuclear, it's normally surrounded by secrecy. So South Africa's nuclear power plant was associated with the bomb building that happened in the apartheid era. When we got to the new proposal a few years ago under President Zuma, eventually we went to court, and the court case revealed that the departments had basically not followed the rules. They had not followed due process, and if they had, we would have not got to the point of even attempting to sign deals with the Russians. And now we seem to be going down the same road. And maybe what's also important is in our uncovering of the corruption that took place, some papers were revealed that had been secret before, which showed that the cost of nuclear had been underestimated, I think, to almost by half. And it had been done when in presenting to cabinet. So for any country in Africa that gets lulled into this idea that nuclear might be a good idea, look at the cost, demand the full costing. In our case, we found that they'd used the wrong dollar-rand exchange rate. They had left out the financing cost in order to make it appear like a good deal. But nuclear is incredibly expensive, and it takes a long time. And if we look at the world, it's not going to help us for climate change. It's not going to help us for electricity supply for the next, if you're lucky, in 20 years' time. And you can take that money and you can build a whole industry in renewable energy in that time. And you can supply people, because you're looking at 2 to 3 years to put a whole lot of power on the grid versus 20 years, and then, the budget's spiraling. And the thing is taking forever to construct. And then what we have is the other issue is is that the regulators then start finding there are problems with some of the safety cases, the construction, which causes further delays. So from our and from South Africa's situation, we have a large, I think we've got almost the largest unemployment. So we need to build industries that will bring not nuclear physicists, of which we've got very few, but ordinary people with welding skills, or with the ex-miners. We need to be providing jobs for them, and we believe that moving into this energy transition will build the country. And this nuclear distraction is a vanity project that sucks resources. And really, it seems to be associated with very bad governance.
Okay. So we know that the Mineral Resources and Energy Minister has released South Africa's new electricity rules, some interesting changes and updated changes there. And it's been much awaited. There are also exemptions, as we've been talking about, in terms of the registration threshold for self-generation facilities from 1 megawatt to about 100 megawatts. No, what type of generation facilities are we talking about? Who's going to benefit from this? Who's available to take advantage of really the new changes?
So these are bigger plants, and these are also very welcome rules, because really what we've seen is that the licensing processes of the regulator can also get bogged down in red tape. And hopefully what we're now seeing, it will be the big energy users. It'll be the big businesses, the mines, the industrial complexes. But what that does is it means that those industries will have stable electricity. They won't be dependent on ESKOM. And that should enable the country to grow.
In the long run, have we been able to put a cost to 13 years and plus of load shedding and blackouts, a cost to how this may have increased South Africa's unemployment rate, added to the pressure on the rand, added to the pressure on the economy? Have there been any studies and research in that, in putting a cost to the situation?
They have. I just can't recall them to hand right now, but it is in the billions. And the cost of unserved energy, it's a very serious cost. And in fact, what we've had to do is run diesel generators, which are highly inefficient from a cost perspective, much longer than we should, because we haven't had the other independent power producers up and running. So I think this year we've seen some big strides, and hopefully we will not be ending up in load shedding for very much longer.
And I think it's a good place to end on a hopeful note that South Africa will not be in the midst of load shedding for much longer. Liz McDaid, thank you so much, Parliamentary and Energy Representative for the Organization of Undoing Tax Abuse in South Africa. We'll be following this very closely because there are a number of African countries still with their state utilities solely providing, distributing, and generating electricity. So this could really provide a roadmap for other African economies. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
Thank you so much.
All right. South Africa's largest economy, or rather, I beg your pardon, most industrialized economy, struggling for the past 13 years to literally power itself. But now things are changing. ESKOM will be unbundled into 3 legally separate entities, and some organizations will be established to ensure that electricity gets to the people. But there's also now the place for independent power producers. How all of this plays out in South Africa is something we'll be watching very closely right here on Business Edge. We'll take a quick time out. So when we come back, we'll be wrapping up the show. And now we're wrapping things up with NC4 to watch. A few stories we're keeping our eyes on. We start in the eastern part of the continent, where the Kenya Electricity Generating Company has received more than 2 million carbon credits from its Olkaria 1 Units 4 and 5 geothermal power plant. The additional the additional 2 million, there we go, 40,515 carbon emission reductions were issued by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, bringing total carbon credits to 2,591,496 tons. That was a mouthful. Let's move on to number 2 now. Algeria has announced that its national carrier will increase the number of international flights it allows from August 28th, partly to help repatriate Algerians stuck abroad since air travel restrictions were imposed at the start of the pandemic last year. The state's carrier, Air Algiers, suspended its international routes in March last year, although it later operated some emergency flights. South Africa's government has unveiled a master plan aimed at harnessing a 28 billion rand, about $1.9 billion cannabis industry that could potentially create as many as 25,000 jobs and help attract foreign investment in the country. South Africa legalized marijuana for personal use in 2018. And finally, after almost a year with no flights and snow and mothballed operations, South African Airways is ready to take to the skies again. The airline has confirmed that it will resume flights on September 23rd, with bookings and travel credit redemptions open from September the 6th. The airline was placed into administration in December 2019, and COVID only added to its woes. With the situation getting worse, the entire business was postponed in September last year, and no flights have taken off since then. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Head to our website, www.newscentral.africa, and download our mobile app on Play Store and App Store. Till next time, I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun.